Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's ACYPL Town Hall, which will explore the food system in the era of COVID-19. Thanksgiving is exactly 1 week from today, and it coincides with a record-breaking surge of COVID-19 cases throughout the United States. Officials across the country are cautioning Americans against participating in holiday gatherings and traveling to see loved ones, recommending instead that holiday celebrations be limited to individual households or even over Zoom, all in an effort to slow the spread of COVID-19 and keep ourselves and each other healthy. Over the past few days, we've seen states move to implement restrictions on bars and restaurants and issue stay-at-home advisories, inching closer to statewide lockdowns. With additional restrictions or lockdowns on the horizon, many consumers are concerned about the availability of the products that they have come to depend on. Our conversation today will address these concerns by examining the food supply chain and the complex network across the United States and around the world that delivers the variety of foods that we're accustomed to having at our local grocery stores. We'll discuss the challenges that COVID-19 has presented to restaurateurs, food producers and distributors, and frontline workers. We'll also examine changing consumer trends and the growing rate of food insecurity in this country, as well as the efforts to address it. Here to discuss these issues are our very own experts and ACYPL alumni, Chef and Food System Reform Consultant, Robert E. Jones, and the Honorable Britt Raybould, member of the Idaho House of Representatives and Chief Financial Officer of her family's farm, Raybould Brothers Farms. Robert E. Jones, a Democrat, is the founding partner of Feeding Change, LLC, a consulting firm that helps corporations around the world that are offering innovative solutions to food system challenges. His clients include food tech startups in Europe, West Coast seafood companies promoting sustainably caught fish, and global NGOs promoting science-based management of natural resources. Robert has 22 years of experience in politics, communications, advocacy, and culinary arts, which he brings to his food system reform work. Robert served as a political appointee in the U.S. Department of Commerce and was director of the Gulf of Mexico at the Environmental Defense Fund from 2014 to 2019. In addition to his work at Feeding Change, Robert hosts Seafoodie, a podcast which offers a mix of stories about cooking, innovating, and protecting marine life. The Honorable Britt Raybould, a Republican, was elected in 2018 to represent District 34, Seat B in the Idaho House of Representatives and will conclude her time in elected office at the end of the month. She has played a key role in creating public policy for her district and serves on the Joint Finance and Appropriations, Resources and Conservation, and Environment, Energy, and Technology committees. She is the Chief Financial Officer of her family's potato farm, Raybould Brothers Farms in Idaho, and manages her own consulting firm that focuses on strategy and marketing for small business owners. This year, Representative Raybould was elected to serve as the president of the National Potato Council, making her the first woman to hold the position and lead the council in its 72-year history. Before she was elected to the Idaho House of Representatives, Representative Raybould served as the Idaho Republican Region 7 Secretary and as the Youth Committee person of the Madison County Republican Party of Idaho. Representative Raybould and Robert, welcome. Thank you for joining us today to discuss this particularly timely subject. Let's kick things off by going back to March when restaurants and bars were closed essentially overnight and seemingly without warning, causing a domino effect within the food system. Robert, could you speak to the immediate impact of the lockdowns, specifically as it relates to restaurant owners and the seafood industry?
Yeah, well, thank you first for having me. I adore this organization. I got to travel to Tunisia and Morocco in 2014, and it was an incredible trip, and I made lifelong friends. And this organization provides an invaluable service to American politics and democracy. So to your question, I think there's going to be a common thread through the conversation today that through this crisis, there's been winners and losers, unfortunately. And as I'm sure we'll get to by the end of the conversation, it's going to be critical that we analyze the why for both of those groups and figure out a way to prevent this from happening again. As for independent restaurants in the US, they definitely bore the brunt of this crisis and continue to. It has been devastating for especially independent restaurants, and that impact has had a multiplier effect that is both economic and human. First and foremost, no one opens a restaurant to get rich. They do it because they love food, they love taking care of people and providing a service to their community. And these restaurants run extraordinarily tight profit margins, and the money that they make today goes to paying invoices for last week. There are about 500,000 independent restaurants in the country, and they really serve as anchors in their communities. And they drive tourism from both domestic and international sources. Those businesses account for about 11 million direct employees in the country and indirectly support about another 5 million more workers up and down the supply chain. Folks like butchers, farmers, fishermen, and to the second part of your question, were particularly impacted. Sorry for the siren noises here. Fishermen were particularly impacted because about 60 to 80%, depending on what species you're talking about 60 to 80% of all domestically harvested seafood in the United States goes directly to restaurants. So when every restaurant in the country shut down on March 13th, fishermen immediately had no place to put their product. The supply chain also includes vintners, launderers, distributors, et cetera, and all of those people were impacted by those closures. Independent restaurants account for about $760 billion for the sales a year. And about 90% of that revenue goes directly to paying for employees and the suppliers and the landlords who own the buildings, which means that about 65% of all of that economic impact recirculates back in those communities. So that's why these independent restaurants are truly anchors in these communities and why it's been so devastating. In all, restaurants account for about 4% of the GDP of the United States. So this was a huge impact. And we know that because nearly 1 in 4 of all the people who lost their jobs during the pandemic and the closure, 1 in 4 were restaurant workers. And these are folks that are some of the most vulnerable in our society. If you've ever been in the back of a restaurant, you know you're looking at mostly immigrant dishwashers and line cooks, servers that probably don't have a college education, or students, single moms, people of color. And so they really bore the brunt of this, and it's really been devastating. And we're making some progress, but I'm really worried about what's coming around the corner.
Thanks, Robert. Britt, similarly, would you walk us through your immediate concerns following the restrictions or lockdowns in March, specifically as it relates to challenges posed to farmers or even agriculture in the U.S. more broadly?
Jacqueline, thank you for inviting me to be here today. It's a pleasure to be speaking with Robert on, I think, an issue that is critical for all of us and that I believe has received some more sustained spotlight over the last few months, given that I think most folks were just so used to walking into a restaurant or a store and finding food on a shelf, and suddenly there were some limitations there. So I appreciate ACYPL taking the opportunity to talk about this and get a discussion going, because, even if we, as we come through this current situation, the odds are good in the future that we will face similar circumstances, be it a future health epidemic, natural disaster, something along those lines, where we could be experiencing a similar disruption. And so we need to learn the lessons now to help strengthen our food system so that we are not facing some of the same problems that we have over the last few months. What I'm seeing on the production side of things very much lines up with a lot of what, Robert's outlined. And it makes a lot of sense because it's all interconnected. We can produce as much food as we want, but if there aren't people to purchase that food, then there's not really a lot of other places for it to go. And I think most I think most people are a little disconnected in the sense that I think they assume that most of the food that gets produced flows into the retail chain, right? So the idea of I go to the store, I get my bag of vegetables, I pick up my bag of flour, I have my loaf of bread, and that's where the bulk of the food goes. You'll hear me reference today, because my major point of experience is in the potato industry. A significant amount of what gets produced in agriculture goes into the commercial chain. So restaurants, schools, heavy purchasers who are buying in large quantities. That's where significant bulk purchases are going. And so, for instance, in the potato industry alone, when the spigot got turned off in March, 60% of our market dried up overnight. Right? People were not going to restaurants and eating baked potatoes or ordering French fries. And so it was a matter of, it wasn't that the food wasn't there and we couldn't potentially send it somewhere else. It's that we had this shift that was required. And in many instances, and I think this is true across multiple commodities, the manufacturers were not prepared. They were not in a situation where they could immediately flip a switch and go from producing large in bulk orders for those retail entities and shifting over to that consumer market. When you think about that 5-pound, 8-pound bag of flour that you go and get on the shelf, it seems like that should be something reasonably easy to keep in stock. But what happened back in March is that we saw this sudden surge of interest, in large part because people weren't going out and buying prepackaged prepared food and doing their own baking at home. Well, a market like the wheat industry, like the flour industry, we've dialed things in to the point where we're very time sensitive. And so at different times of the year, manufacturers are looking at projections and going, okay, how much do we need to produce of this particular SKU in order to make sure that we're meeting demand? Well, that projection was turned on its head overnight. And so they went from having to figure out how to make sure they were filling these large commercial orders of 50 and 100-pound bags of flour in one pass to how do we go about getting more of this particular product on the shelf? And they just weren't prepared for it. I mean, even something as simple as being able to go out and get enough of the paper product that was needed to create the consumer package, they had difficulties resourcing and getting that in. And there was also scenarios where these manufacturers had concerns about how can we safely continue to be in production, right? I mean, you're talking about a scenario where most of the ag industry was deemed to be essential workers, but that didn't mean that they faced less risk in terms of going to work every day. And so you also had these companies in a situation where they were also trying to source PPE and figuring out health and safety procedures that their companies needed to follow in order to protect the safety of their workers. And so it wasn't just a case of suddenly we don't have a market to send things and therefore suddenly this food isn't available. It's that there wasn't something where we could immediately shift over and say, okay, well, now we can suddenly start pushing that much more food into the retail, individual consumer market. And I think it was a wake-up call, not only for those, manufacturers and those who are producing the food, but also for those who are supplying it. Because we're used to a pretty regular schedule of folks coming into storage facilities and removing X amount of what we've produced at any given time to keep the flow up within the system. And it essentially came to a screeching halt because, for instance, in the potato industry, potatoes are graded based on a particular size. And based on the size as they come through the warehouse, they're packaged accordingly. And we were reaching the point where we had a large number of what we refer to as cartons. So potatoes of a particular size that are most likely to end up in a restaurant setting. We were running through our supply and producing the same, roughly the same number of cartons that we always do, and also producing, the same number of consumer bags that end up in a grocery store as we normally do. But guess where all the demand was? It was for those consumer bags, on the retail side of things. And yet we had all of these cartons for restaurants sitting on the floor of warehouses. And so there was a big disconnect between, what we could produce, because we still had to go through the pile. We can't selectively go into a storage and only pull out the kind of potatoes that are sized for consumer bags. They're all stored together. So I think opened a lot of people's eyes to some of the weaknesses within the system. And it had, to Robert's point, I think a domino effect across the board for everybody is sort of like, wow, nobody saw this coming.
Thanks, Britt. And I think you've given me a great segue to my next question, which is consumer trends. At the onset of the pandemic in the spring, what were the changes in consumer trends? And can you speak to those a little bit? Robert, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, first of all, Britt really nailed it there. And I think for those of you who are not familiar with the food system, conceptualize it in sort of four major buckets of production, processing, distribution, and consumption. And we saw breakdowns in all four of those buckets, but processing was really where a lot of bottlenecks occurred. But to your question about consumer trends, were largely driven by the consumption breakdown, which was with the closure of restaurants all over the country. So people have to eat, right? I mean, the grocery store became the primary source of everyday meals. And so you have people flooding into grocery stores or ordering online. And Britt touched on this a little bit, but their consumption habits changed. All of a sudden, everybody was baking as a way to occupy time. And so that had an impact. There was news all over the country about problems with meat processing plants and COVID outbreaks that led to fear of shortages and actual shortages, which drove a really interesting trend that we saw was a huge growth nearly overnight in people buying plant-based products in grocery stores. Companies like Beyond and Impossible Meat were able to capitalize on that because they were able to be ready and beef up their, pun intended, beef up their processing. And you saw people trying plant-based meats for the first time. They had hundreds of % of growth for plant-based products, ranging from plant-based milk, plant-based meat, as just one example of interesting trends that we saw come out of this. And then obviously another huge consumer trend that's been driven, and I think is probably here to stay, is people ordering digitally. One of the winners in this crisis was the companies that were standing by ready to deliver food either from restaurants or from grocery stores, and have seen huge growth. And we will probably see that digital footprint stay even after the vaccine is settled in.
Britt, anything you want to add to that on the subject of consumer trends?
I think the only thing I would add is there's been a lot of debate over the years around this idea of what's happened to the family meal, and the notion of, families have sort of gone and done their own thing, gone and gotten their own food. I think, and I don't necessarily believe it'll be every single night or even, multiple times, during a week, but I'm inclined to say that based on some of the feedback and some of the research I've seen, that's one of the things that's likely to stay, is that we'll see more in-home consumption, more in-home meal preparation than we have previously. And it will be interesting to see how restaurants adapt. My local grocery store, even prior to the pandemic, had started putting together, had classes that they offered locally, and people could come in, buy all the ingredients, and they helped lead meal prep, so that you could then, go through, prep all your meals, come home, put them in the freezer, and then when you were ready, drop them into the crock pot. I think something like that is going to become more of a trend with other food producers who are potentially worried about losing some of that in-house traffic, a way to still bring people in, even if they maybe aren't necessarily consuming, food on the premises.
Got it. So on the subject of the food supply chain, regardless of the season or where we live, Americans are generally accustomed to having whatever we might want to eat available to us, either at the grocery store or at a restaurant, thanks to the vast, and I imagine very complex food supply chain system, which has been under stress, I imagine, again, since March. What are some of the vulnerabilities that you've seen in the system as it tried to adapt to the circumstances and meet the demands posed by COVID-19? Let's start on that subject by addressing just product product movement. Robert, let's start with you.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. Well, we saw that those stressors really expose themselves in several places. Well, and you pointed out, I mean, we have a very luxurious food system in the United States. And that needs to be one of the questions that we ask ourselves is how sustainable is that moving forward? We've gotten used to having produce, whether it's in season or not, because it's grown somewhere and then flown in or trucked in. To meet our demands, which have become a little bit unreasonable in my opinion. But one of the real failures that we saw was on the logistics side, on the distribution side. With meeting that demand and moving produce from one end of the country to the other. Where all of a sudden overnight we saw, truck stops close, for example, and trucking become very difficult in moving that product from one end of the country to the other. And that resulted in one of the worst byproducts of the situation was really devastating amount of food waste. That we saw. I think everyone saw the images on national television of millions of gallons of milk being dumped down drains. Because, and Britt hit on this, if you make widgets for a living and you have too many widgets or you don't have a way to move widgets to your customers, you can put them in boxes and put them in storage and wait. That's not the case with perishable food. You have a shelf life. You have cows that have to be milked, whether there's somebody to buy the milk or not. And so it resulted in, at one point we were dumping about 3.7 million gallons of milk a week. We were throwing away 750,000 eggs a week. And then we had tens of millions of pounds of fresh produce that had to just be tilled over because of the breakdown in the system of both demand from restaurants and an ability to move it across the country. And for me, the most devastating part of that really had to do with animal protein, though. As the processing plants and that system broke down, and you had plants close all over the country, you had a bottleneck where farmers didn't have a place to move their animals to for processing. And every day that an animal is alive, it costs money to feed it. And you had farmers who were looking at going bankrupt just because of that. As a result, we had to euthanize millions of animals. That I'm a hardcore carnivore and I will always eat meat and don't have a weak stomach, but this is not a pretty picture. I mean, we're talking about them spraying foam on top of chickens to suffocate them, or just shutting off the ventilation system, which causes a spike in heat and then just organ failure from heat exhaustion. And then millions of pigs that were gassed with carbon dioxide to euthanize them. A really ugly picture and an underbelly that we really need to look at addressing moving forward. I'm sure there's more examples that Britt has, but those are the things that really stuck in my mind.
Yeah, Britt, anything you'd like to add to that point?
Robert touched on something, with the idea of how much food was going to waste. And I, of course, was getting questions lobbed my direction on a pretty steady basis when it was happening. It was, well, why can't you just give the food away? Why can't you just, give it to food banks? Why, and this is the part where, again, I go back to, I think most people see what they expect to see when they walk in a grocery store, but don't necessarily understand all of the steps that go to ensuring that that food gets to the grocery store. And at the volumes that manufacturers are dealing with when they're processing milk or when they're packaging, fresh produce, there is no way to take that quantity and shift it over into a tiny stream that would be representative of a local food bank, right? So it wasn't a case of, I didn't hear a single producer ever say, no, I'm unwilling to have my food given away to people who are in need. There just wasn't a system available to facilitate the delivery of it. And I know in some areas, Washington State in particular, some of the potato growers came together and they basically started handing out free bags of potatoes that they couldn't otherwise ship. And so there would be a lineup of cars, coming into a parking lot, and they were handing out these bags of potatoes that previously would have gone into the supply chain to become French fries. But again, no restaurants, no opportunity to make French fries, so they were handing over these fresh potatoes. But The ability in that instance and the number of people that could potentially be affected by that giveaway is so tiny in comparison to the overall problem. And the system doesn't really have a relief valve in place to help us accommodate those kinds of things. And so when we talk about moving product around, the real weakness is that product moves great as long as it can go everywhere it needs to go. But what we've seen revealed is that when that regular movement of product gets interrupted, we don't have something that just can slide into place behind it and help us redirect into other areas. Things essentially came to a screeching halt, and there weren't really good substitutes that you could immediately drop in place of them.
You both beat me to it. I was going to ask you for a crash course in supply and demand, but I think we've gotten it. So thank you. You know, another component of the food supply chain that I'd like to speak to, a crucial part, is the frontline workers in the food industry, those who are tasked with product collection, be it in the fields or elsewhere, as well as product packaging and then distribution to the public. As I said, the food supply chain depends on these workers. They were deemed essential. So could you speak to the realities of being an essential frontline worker in the food industry during COVID-19? Britt, let's start with you.
You know, my experience, because we are not having to have employees in the fields on a day-to-day basis like we do, you know, like they do with some of the hand crops, primarily, you know, in California and whatnot. But I'll admit it was harrowing. You know, by the time we reached the point where it was time to go in and harvest the crop, every single day I woke up was a day that I had dread in my stomach, because we were providing PPE for our employees, and we were ensuring that people kept their distance, and as much as possible, we were working outdoors, no enclosed spaces. And yet at the same time, I had absolutely zero control over whether or not someone in my crew would show up with an infection, and then what that would mean for, you know, tipping everything else down the line. The issue was even more critical, particularly early on in the spring, when you were looking at, you know, the workers who had to be out in the field doing that straight from field to market process. And, you know, this is a scenario where in California, a lot of these crews are moving around. And then the question becomes, well, how can those crews safely move around from farm to farm and from county to county to do this work if we're concerned about infection? And so as a result, here are these folks on the front lines who are depending on to ensure that we still have food on the table. And yet their level of risk, I think, was significantly higher than most people thought about, just simply based on sort of the circumstances that they found themselves in, of still needing to do this particular job, but having to do it under just very, very difficult circumstances, and there not being a lot of alternatives. You know, we can't just send a machine into the field to pick the strawberries. People still had to go in and pick the strawberries, put them in little crates in order for them to end up, you know, in the stores. And so again, this kind of goes back to, this is a system that has some very specific things about it that determine what can and can't happen. And when something comes along and interrupts how we've been doing it, there are not obvious replacements that can come in behind and help sort of fill in the gap, right? And I think when we saw what was happening with frontline workers, both in the fields, and I'm sure Robert will speak to, you know, what's happening in some of in the production facilities, it was sort of a scenario of, well, as long as food's still coming out, then it must be okay, right? When the reality, I think, was something much different for those who are on the ground doing the work and were finding themselves in some really difficult circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, you know, looking at the next step in the chain on the processing side, this is interwoven with a bigger pattern that we've seen in the United States. You know, 50 years ago, there were about 2,000 meat packing plants in the country, mostly small scale. Today, there's 1,000, and most of those are very large scale facilities. And so you have this bottleneck occur where you have these giant facilities, mostly in rural places across the country, where as COVID began to work its way into those facilities, it spread like wildfire. I mean, if you look at the infection rates for the counties where these large meatpacking plants occur, oftentimes the infection rate in that county would be 500–600% higher than the state average for that state. And it would be because of those large facilities. It took these companies a while to figure out. There was a kind of a combination of a lack of guidance as well as just scrambling with the situation. It took them a while to figure out, how do we retrofit these facilities to try to keep our workers safe, get them back to work, and deal with these infection rates. And it only took a couple of big processing plants to shut down to impact, double-digit percentage of the market of meat packing in the country. And to your point, I mean, these are some of the most vulnerable people in our country. Many of them immigrant workers, one paycheck away from a financial crisis, and being put in the position of going to work and putting their lives at stake in order to feed us. And so that is really something that we need to look at as we talk about reforms and resilience, and preventing this from happening again.
The pandemic has ushered in a time of economic instability, which is another painful component of this pandemic. But with it, there's also food insecurity. And I think it's worth stressing that many Americans don't have the luxury of enjoying a holiday meal next week for Thanksgiving, and instead will go to bed hungry. And I'm wondering, you've already spoken to the really staggering levels of food waste, and how that compares with increasing numbers of Americans facing food insecurity. But I'm wondering if we could take that a bit further and speak to the number of Americans experiencing food insecurity in the era of COVID-19, maybe compared to years past. Robert, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, I mean, there is a real juxtaposition there, right? I mean, there is a really cruel irony as we watched them dump milk and kill millions of animals that would not go for human consumption. At the same time, millions of Americans lost their job. Pre-COVID, we had about 30 million Americans who were considered food insecure on a daily basis. That number is closer to 55% or 55 million today. So a staggering increase in the number of families around the country that are food insecure. And that is from folks who have lost their jobs, and many of them associated with the food industry, many of them restaurant workers. We've gotten back up on our feet to some extent, in figuring out a way to make the system work, to provide daily meals to some of those people. But just here the other day, there was, folks around the nation were looking at footage of Dallas, Texas, and 4 lanes of cars miles long waiting outside the Dallas Food Bank, trying to get a box of food for Thanksgiving. It's a sad state of affairs, and we have to figure out a way to improve the logistics so that when we have overages, which we almost always do, again, in a food system that by and far works really well, figure out a way to logistically move that excess food to who needs it. And that needs to be a core part of reforming the food system moving forward.
Britt, anything you'd like to add to that?
I think in addition to what happened as we saw more folks losing their jobs, I think people underestimated the impact of what happened when schools closed. And, there was a lot of emphasis on, the quality of education and things that students, whether or not they could get the same thing in a virtual experience. But something that got glossed over was access to meals. A lot of students in the United States find themselves in a position where they're either on reduced or free lunch meals and receiving the same thing, in some school districts, they receive breakfast as well. And so when they stopped attending school because the schools were closed this spring, it became potentially for some students up to 2 fewer meals that they knew for sure where they were going to get food that day. And I think that when we're talking about the idea of food insecurity, I suspect that most people don't understand all the different sources where folks are getting their nutrition, right? So, we're talking about school meals, we're talking about WIC, the Women and Infant with Children, that nutrition program, along with SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Program that's overseen by USDA. And, if you're looking at a food system where a large majority, even beyond those who are food insecure, but those who are also dependent on some sort of subsidy in order to get their food, then you start having to ask yourself, some really, I think, serious questions about how that system works. So for instance, if someone who's receiving SNAP benefits or WIC benefits goes to the grocery store, depending upon which program they're on, there may be some limitations for the kinds of foods or even the types of brands that they can purchase. Well, we saw a lot of bare shelves during the spring. And so it, again, sort of puts you in the situation of going, well, are there individuals who potentially didn't have the option of buying anything other than what would have been allowed on their particular program, who ended up not being able to get that food because that specific brand or that particular item was no longer available? And so as a whole, I think that when we're talking about food insecurity, I think some underlying discussions need to be had about what we're looking at when we're talking about good nutrition and what it means to have access to a healthy source of food across the spectrum, understanding that not every family can walk into a grocery store, fill up their cart, and go home knowing that they've got enough food to ensure that there's meals on the table for their kids.
Sure. So we've definitely identified the challenges, but I'd like to change gears and focus on support. What was the government response to the spike in food insecurity rates? We've talked about some of the food programs, but I'm wondering if there are others that were specifically targeted to this spike seen because of COVID-19. Britt, let's start with you.
So in the beginning, I think there was a lot of debate about what actually was needed. And I don't know how many people followed along with those conversations. They weren't exactly the most exciting of discussions that were being had, but at the heart of it, it was kind of this, what's sort of the most immediate thing we can do to get the biggest bang for our buck. And it came back around to the idea of potentially leveraging existing programs. How can we get more benefit from them? And I think Robert's probably going to spend a lot of time talking about it later, but the idea of the Farmers to Families Food Box program was something that they came up with. I also think there was some discussion around the idea that the PPP program that put out some additional dollars to business owners could, in theory, those dollars could flow through into paychecks and potentially help families continue to have the ability to go out and buy food for their families. The thing around all of this is that we're talking about a system that is so big and so interconnected and has so many different players in it that I think where the biggest struggle came was not really understanding where to push the buttons. And so I think initially in the beginning, there was a lot of guessing going on. Well, if we do something over here, we think it will lead to this over there, but we're not 100% sure about that. Or if we, promote this particular program or encourage this kind of behavior, then maybe that will help smooth things out. So for instance, there was some discussion around how do we facilitate being able to move food in between distributors and markets when truck stops are being closed and drivers who are limited under Department of Labor rules can only be on the road driving for so many hours. And so there were some conversations on some things that you would think wouldn't have anything to do with food that had to happen to help sort of unkink the system. And thankfully those conversations happen, and I'm hopeful that based on some of those things that we've seen in lessons learned, that they'll continue to sort of progress and say, how can we continue to facilitate and ensure that food keeps moving through the system?
Thanks, Britt. And Robert, posing the same question to you, but also adding, were there any efforts put in place to stabilize the restaurant industry? And if so, were those successful?
Yeah. One of the best ways to move people away from being food insecure is to put them back to work. And so, the first iteration of the CARES Act was not super helpful for the restaurant industry because the Paycheck Protection Program started a clock that was unreasonable for restaurants because they were still under mandated closures. So it didn't do restaurants good to take the money, have the clock start, and them still be closed and not having money come in the door. We eventually fixed that. And by May, had many restaurants back up and running to some extent, depending on local and state rules around COVID. And many restaurants were able to take PPP loans and hire back at least some of their employees, which was helpful. And then, of course, outdoor dining during the summer months provided some reprieve for those restaurants. The problem we have, though, is many of those PPP loans are set to expire soon. We're moving into a cold weather season where dining outdoors is not an option for a large part of the country. And as you mentioned at the top of the call, we are experiencing another big spike. And so we're seeing closures again in localities and states all over the country. So we're staring down another crisis with restaurants. And so what we've done is helped, and it bought a lot of people time, but it is not a long-term solution. And we are looking at some pretty serious closures. So I'm sure we can cover that a little bit more later.
So looking ahead, you know, what are the broad lessons that we've learned since the onset of COVID-19, and what are the opportunities to do better, whether it is, you know, government involvement or government involvement aside? How are advocates or those within the industry rethinking the system structure, and what changes might be on the horizon? Britt, let's start with you.
I think the last few months have revealed that as the food industry moved to sort of a just-in-time mentality, right? So you literally didn't worry about restocking a store until they were down to 1 or 2 items on the shelf, you know, that sort of thinking. I think that's taken a hit. I think that the belief that you can continue to sort of have a system just sort of flow along and assume, you know, things will just work has been revealed to have some pretty serious shortcomings. Whether you're someone that's on the producer end and you're essentially trying to make an assessment about what you're going to plant the next year. So, you know, for instance, we're in the process of working out contracts for next year's crops. And some of those contracts are tied in part to what's going to happen in the restaurant industry. And we are gambling to a certain extent that we will be back to some level of normality in 2021, courtesy of, you know, most likely the vaccine and the virus dying down from that, and allowing, you know, the idea that people are going to be able to be back in dining rooms. Now, my hands are tied, right? You know, once I have those contracts, once I buy those inputs, that's it. That's what I'm going to have to go into the ground with come spring. And I don't know how we change that underlying system in particular, because there's X amount of time that's required to grow a crop. This isn't something where I can go out and buy a new mold and have, you know, my machine making one thing one day and turn around the next day and be making something else. There's just that period of time that's required when you're on the producer end, that once you're committed, you're committed. And so from that standpoint, I don't see there being a lot of flexibility there. If I'm looking at it from sort of the factory, wholesaler, warehouse, distributor, I think, you know, based on the feedback I've heard, is most everyone is looking at how to make their facilities more flexible, right? How can they put themselves in a position where, yes, this may be the most likely scenario of the types of products and the amount of products that they need to produce, but given the levels of automation and the new technology that's coming along, I've heard a lot more willingness to sort of explore this idea of, what do we need to have in place in order to help us make a shift in the event that something like this happens down the road? And so I think that's very helpful for both ends, you know, both sides, but both those who are producing as well as those who are purchasing, with the, you know, with the ability for them to be more flexible, more nimble in the middle of something. You know, it would, I can't guarantee it, but I think it would go a long ways towards helping us avoid some of the you know, the very thing that I think has alarmed most of us, which is the excessive amount of waste that the system, you know, had to essentially shed from itself as we went, because there was no other alternative but to go that path, just, you know, sort of given the facts of life. And so from that standpoint, I think that we're seeing some positive moves in that direction, but you know, we'll have to see if it becomes something that stays within the system long term, or if people slide back into what was comfortable from before.
Robert, anything you'd like to add before we move on?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think central to that conversation is that we need to take a hard look at the amount of consolidation that has occurred in the food industry in the country, mostly at the processing level of our food system. And the kind of flexibility that Britt is talking about, I think can be built for producers if they weren't sending all of their product to a handful of processors around the country, and instead had a more diverse portfolio that they could move that product to. That means going back to more small scale meat packing processing facilities. It means more farmers and fishermen building direct to consumer models and having the ability to move their product directly to American consumers instead of going through a middleman. And us encouraging more of a farm to table ethic all through the food system, where people are moving product to their communities first and building food systems that are more central to those communities in order to create more efficiency and more diversity so that you have the resiliency to stand up to a crisis like this.
Thank you both. I'm curious, do you anticipate government funding for producers or restaurateurs in the near future, be it through the next COVID-19 relief bill or by way of the Restaurants Act that I was just reading about? Is that likely, or is that kind of a distant hope, for lack of a better word? Robert, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, on the Restaurant Act, and I will say positively that I am hopeful that there will be additional action either in the new administration, with the new administration coming in and with Congress. And the reason I say that is because it is a must. If we do not extend out additional support to independent restaurants in this country, and the Restaurants Act calls for $120 billion, which is kind of the bare bones need. The most popular economic projection is that we could lose up to 85% of independent restaurants with permanent closures in this country. Think about how devastating that would be for communities all over the country. And I just don't think our leaders are going to allow that to happen, not only for what it does to the culture of those communities, but the economic impact to communities across the country. So I'm hopeful that we're going to see additional support with passage of the Restaurant Act, and deal with the crippling debt that these restaurants have taken on during this crisis. Look, as a chef and someone who has worked in restaurants, I'll tell you, there is not a more resilient crowd than folks who work in commercial kitchens. They will figure out a way to adapt and be resilient in this new environment. We just have to give them a hand up long enough to survive this.
And Britt, I'll pose the same question to you with regards to federal support to producers specifically.
Right now, we're in the midst of what's referred to as CFAP 2.0, and it's the producer-focused relief program that was put together and was rolled out here over the last couple of months. I think it's unlikely that there is targeted relief for the producer side of things going forward. There was a prior CFAP version 1.0. You gotta love government. They like their version numbers. But there's been quite a healthy bit of money that's been put into the producer side of things. And I also think, sort of given the timing of it, right? I mean, for those of us who are growing sort of those seasonal crops, the crops are out of the ground, they're in storage. Most folks had, at many instances had contracts. I just think the financial formula is much different for producers at this point than it is for those who are on the restaurant side. And, from that standpoint, I wholeheartedly advocate what Robert's talking about. I want customers for my products going forward. And if we're talking about literally, the wiping out of the independent restaurant industry, I'm horrified at the thought of that, because those are the folks who keep coming back. They may not necessarily have the huge, massive orders of the chain restaurants, but independents are really, in large respect, the backbone of our food service industry. And I would hate to see those many instances, family-owned businesses find it untenable to continue to operate. And so I would echo, Robert's remarks. I am optimistic that those who are in a position to do something about it will act, and that hopefully they will not have waited too long in order for it to have a positive outcome.
And how long, a question for both of you, how long do you see, or where do you see this trend of retail over service going? Is it here to stay? And I know none of us can look into the future and predict what's going to happen, especially this year, but what do you anticipate with regards to that consumer trend? Robert, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I think Britt was right earlier. I think we will see a continuation of more people getting back to cooking at home than pre-COVID for a variety of reasons. That's good for many reasons, especially on the nutrition side. But I also think that you'll see restaurants adapt, and they already are, to as part of this new post-COVID world, to have hybrid business models centered around the kind of meal kits that she described. And I've seen a lot of restaurants actually adapt and create small markets in their footprint, their brick and mortar footprint, to be selling produce and meal kits in addition to prepared food from the kitchen. And the other trend that I think you will see is the use of ghost kitchens. And for those of you who haven't heard that term, there's real estate all over the country right now, many of them parking lots being converted to real estate for food trailers that are serving as ghost kitchens to prepare food for to-go and delivery from name brands. And there's a lot of advantages to that, lower cost than having a brick and mortar. But I think that foretells the trend that we have seen in this new digital age, especially that was accelerated by COVID, of more and more people ordering to go and delivery meals from their favorite restaurants and not actually going into the brick and mortar. And so I think we'll see a continuation of that.
Britt, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think there is one aspect that doesn't seem like it would be related to food consumption, but I think it plays a key role, and that's what we're doing around work. Most people, I think, were in the habit when they were at work, they'd go out for lunch every day, in some capacity, right? You may brown bag a time or two a week, but I don't think it's unusual to say that most people probably went out to lunch 2 or 3 times a week. And I think it's sort of twofold. So there's both sort of that during the workday, what you're consuming in terms of food, but also at night, if we continue with this work from home trend, it is supportive of, more of this idea of people cooking from home. But if we start seeing more of a shift back to sort of that traditional 8 to 5, you're going into the office every day, I would expect to see a drop off in terms of folks being willing and or having the desire to then come home at the end of the workday after their commute and then, try to prep a meal for their family and be more interested in sort of that takeout or, go in and sit down and eat option. And so I think that's another trend that's going to be somewhat telling going forward as to what we see happen in food service, as to whether or not those two things that I think have been very complementary to each other, over time, what happens with that going forward too.
I am certainly guilty of being one of those people who buys lunch regularly, and I'll be honest, I miss those days. Bringing the conversation back to present day, as we said at the top, we're currently seeing a surge of COVID-19 cases, restrictions on business, and potential lockdowns to address the pandemic. Officials are already cautioning Americans against panic buying or stockpiling necessities that we saw when paper towels and toilet paper were nowhere to be found for a little while. What are the implications for the food supply chain right now? Has it had time to adapt to the circumstances? And beyond that, what are the implications for farmers, fishers, and restaurateurs, looking ahead to this time that we might be anticipating? And is it wishful thinking to hope that the holidays might factor into the equation positively? Robert, let's start with you.
Well, speaking to the consumption side first, especially on the restaurant side, I do not think we've had time to adapt well enough to survive what might be coming around the corner. That's why, as per earlier, we have to have additional federal assistance for these restaurants. Because I think we're about to have a pretty rough patch until the vaccine is widely available and people feel comfortable going back into restaurants, even after mandated closures are lifted. I think they're adapting. I think they will get there, but they're not there yet. And I know, I spent many years working in seafood, and so on the seafood side of production, I think a lot of large-scale fishing operations and even small-scale fishermen have started to figure out how to adapt to a direct-to-consumer model and built relationships to provide their local grocery stores. And we've seen an increase in seafood consumption of people cooking seafood at home. I think they will make it. I think they need additional resources, but I think they're better positioned to survive than the restaurant industry is.
Britt, anything you'd like to add there?
I don't want to be a downer by any means, but I've got some serious concerns about the transportation side of things. The reports that I've heard even just this week as processors are attempting to get trucks and rail lined up in order to move orders to market for Thanksgiving, they're coming up short. We are low on drivers. That's been an ongoing issue within that industry, for a number of years, but, COVID has just exacerbated it and made it that much more difficult to ensure that, that we've got someone, behind the wheel who can carry that load across the country. Rail service has been difficult. Knowing that, I think that I don't necessarily think we're going to be any worse off than how we were this spring. And yes, you're probably still going to see people who can't figure out how to, ration their toilet paper and their paper towels accordingly. But as a whole, I don't know that we're going to have sort of the same huge disruptions that we had in the spring going through the winter. Now, where I may be forced to eat my words is if we get into the winter and we see a really significant spike in infections and it starts shutting down manufacturing, right? So it starts shutting down facilities that are doing that middleman production, turning raw product into finished product. If that happens, I think we're going to have a very rude awakening in terms of you may not be able to go to the grocery store for a period of time and have access to everything you're used to having access to. And then it will take some time to get those systems spun back up and running again. And my encouragement for anyone who may be listening to this is don't panic. We are not going to run out of food. That's not the way our system is set up. But I would encourage everyone to be flexible themselves. If there's not the precise food that you're looking for at the grocery store, look for a substitute. Treat it as an opportunity to potentially try something that you haven't tried before with your families. And be aware that this is not a case of, being a fault of, the retailer or even, the restaurateur. If you're going to the restaurant and they have a more scaled back version of their menu, it's just a recognition that the system itself cannot be at 100% at this point in time, and everybody's just doing the best that they can.
Yeah, I would quickly add to that. I think that's completely right. And if you're a consumer sitting at home thinking, how can I be part of the solution? It is to join a CSA. It's to go to your farmers markets. It's to order food from local independent restaurants in your community and give them that lifeline that they need right now. And you may not get all of the products that you're used to getting, but at least what you're buying, buy as much as you can locally.
I was going to ask you both what we can do to be supportive. And again, you've beaten me to it. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and end there, concluding today's town hall. Britt and Robert, thank you for taking the time to talk through these important and timely issues that are affecting all of us in one way or another. And thanks also to everybody who joined us today. A quick note to our viewers, as our exchange work transitions to virtual engagement during the COVID-19 pandemic, it is vital that we measure the impact and effect of the virtual town hall series for our founding partners, or excuse me, funding partners, not founding, funding. To do this, we ask that audience members complete a brief exit survey. Zoom attendees can view the survey link on the Zoom post-attendee screen and will also receive it in an email tomorrow. Viewers on Facebook Live and YouTube can find the survey link in the video description on the respective platform. Thank you in advance for taking the survey and helping us measure the impact of our programming during this time. And again, thank you to our speakers and viewers. Take care, stay safe this holiday season, and I hope to see you here again soon. So thanks again, everybody. Take care.
Thank you, Robert.
Nice to talk to you.